The problem is really in this Reality Labs. The amount of investment that they're making is so outsized and so abnormal and doesn't compare to anything anybody's ever seen. I think everything else in the business seems to be actually quite functional. So the problem is that this above the line thing, though, has become so big, it could sink the business.
In his most recent podcast, Chamath Palihapitiya discussed the big tech starts making cuts, and what this means for the broader economy and startups. Chamath shared his thoughts about global debt numbers, Fed incompetency and more. Before listening to him, please ensure to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel.
The meta problem is it's a deep and a very dangerous situation that they've put themselves in, which is why their MAU values are this low. But, if you had done this analysis a few years ago, the trade was looking at Meta's MAU values being so high where you would have said, why isn't Twitter doing more? I think the most powerful change that Twitter could make today is there are two classes of users. People who are verified real world identity.
Yeah.
And people who want to stay anonymous.
Correct.
There is 100% distribution fire hose for people who are real.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a fire hose for fake people or with fake names that you need to pay to amplify. Just that one simple change will cut through all the nonsense.
Yeah.
Because if you want to see where the money is being spent, you will be able to see very quickly, because otherwise there'll be virtually no distribution for anonymous fake people. And it'll force those people, if they really want to be heard, and that there's something valuable to say, to spend against it. No offense to all the people out there, although I don't really care, but no offense, but you cannot use Twitter as a coping mechanism, okay? Like, I get that life is hard, or that, life hasn't lived out to your expectations, or, there's envy and whatever of other people. But to go out there and spew hate doesn't solve anything.
Are you talking about the Brigadoons?
Well, there's also just a lot of people that are just in general, they're just mean. And I'll give you a perfect example. There was a woman that I saw on TikTok, and she's like, been married for 13 years, mother of 2 kids. And she had a thing that went viral where she was talking about who's in charge, her or her husband. And it was a very funny little thing. And so I followed a couple of her videos just to see what else she had posted. And one of the videos was how she has some complicated health issues, which she was very public about, PCOS, and how it causes, issues in losing weight. And she posted a pre and post picture of her, which takes a lot of courage. And she was like brigadooned. And it's like, what is wrong with these broken people that have to give this woman a hard time? And so to me, these social media channels are not coping mechanisms. They were never meant to be. And so, if they have to go to 4chan or 8chan or Reddit or whatever, better to sort of create these honeypots of hatred than to have it spew everywhere, because it makes for the rest of us these platforms to be unusable. Nobody is banned forever.
Okay.
I think that when somebody is banned temporarily, they can be banned for any reason that violates a term of service that's well understood and uniformly enforced.
Got it.
And I think that's the right of a private company. But there has to be a way to get back on. In the case of both of these folks, there should be a way to basically, have, because of the quantity of their reach, some sort of almost like tribunal or, mediator that can understand what's going on. Because if somebody's going through a manic episode, it's absolutely right to turn that off. I mean, these guys should have turned him off much, much sooner. Because when you're in the middle of a mania, and I said this last week, like, for example, like this relative of mine, when they're in a manic episode, it's 60, 70, 80 emails a day and text messages, 100 texts that I get. And they're vile. They go through paranoia, they go through mania, they go through these periods where they think they're completely right. They go through these periods where they look completely sane and normal. So
that's a tough part.
The most important thing when you have a family member in mental health crisis is to get the phone away from them. That is a weapon that only continues the loop, and to re-regulate this person. And then there should be a way to prove that you're back in a re-regulated state to get these tools back. But I think that we just need to acknowledge, like, there's just a lot of people with mental health issues. There's a lot of social media. There's a lot of damage that can be done. It's not to forgive these people, but it's to explain that in moments, you got to shut these channels down and then give them a way to come back when they've re-regulated. When you look at Apple versus Meta, there's this really interesting thing that comes up, which is in 2016, and we've said this before, you could not give Apple stock away. They were generating a ton of cash. It was sitting on the balance sheet. In many ways, Facebook was doing the same thing. And there was this famous dinner. I don't know if it was a dinner that ever happened, but that's how the lore is told, between Tim Cook, Carl Icahn, and I think Luca Maestri, the CFO. And in it, what Carl Icahn said is, listen, I have a below-the-line suggestion for Apple. And what does that mean? If you look at a P&L, you have your revenues, that's above the line. Mm-hmm. You have costs, that's also above the line. And then you have your profits, and then it's what you do with the profits. So what he was suggesting is below the line. After the fact, he had no suggestions for how the business should be run. He just said, give us back the money, and we will reward you. The stock price will go up. And what's interesting to note here is the black line is the performance of Apple stock as they've given back, and they've used a ton of their own balance sheet cash to buy back the stock. Okay, so they've spent $396 billion since 2016 to buy back stock. In the same time, Facebook has spent almost $100 billion. Now, here's where you start to see the divergence. So you would have said, well, shouldn't Facebook's stock have reacted in the same way? And for a very long time, it actually looked like it was, right until about September 21. And then obviously this thing fell off a cliff. And the reason why it started to fall off a cliff was somebody started to notice that, hold on a second, even though you're buying back all these shares, the bottom of the funnel, right? You're leaking all of these shares to all of these new employees. Why are you hiring so many people? And this is when people started to uncover what was happening above the line at Facebook and is what caused this massive dispersion. So, Nick, if you go to the first chart, so what has actually been going on above the line? Here's what's going on. If you look at the light purple bar, Facebook in the last 2 years have spent $25 billion on reality labs. And they said that they're going to spend, meaningfully more in 2023 and then sustain that investment for a while. So if you do a little bit of math, if they spend around $4 billion a quarter right now, so $16 billion a year, that'll go to $25 billion in 2023, and then they'll sustain that. What that means is that over this, 12 or 13 year life of reality labs as we've seen it, these guys will have spent $250 billion. And what I did here was I just wanted to understand.
Hilarious.
I wanted to understand $250 billion in the context of other major leaps in humanity. So at the left is what Apple spent in its entirety. By the way, these are all inflation adjusted dollars for today. Apple spent $3.6 billion to create the first iPhone. And what they did was they said every subsequent version of the iPhone would only be funded from the cash flow and profits of the generation before it, right? So they used consumer demand as their guiding principle. So it was a very incremental approach. iPhone 1, iPhone 2, and now we're at iPhone, 14 or whatever, 13. But the point is, it took $3.6 billion to get that juggernaut off the ground. The Manhattan Project will cost $23 billion in today's dollars to create the atomic bomb. Tesla, in its entire life, spent $25 billion to get to free cash flow profitability. And they took this incremental approach as well. We'll create the coupe, the Roadster, then the Model S, then the Model X. They iterated their way. They used customer demand and all of that revenue to fund future growth. The cum spend on Tesla was $25 billion. Boeing spent $32. Google and other bets has spent $40. The only thing that I could find in history that is comparable to what Meta has basically said they're going to spend is the entire Apollo program, which cost in today's dollars $250 billion as well. So the problem is that below the line, Meta was doing the right things. above the line, they've created, I think, an enormous set of pressures for themselves, which is, if you think about the Apollo program, this was 13 years of building rockets, getting to low Earth orbit, then getting to be able to, orbit the Earth, then eventually building an entire infrastructure and capability to land on the moon and get back. So there was a lot of incremental progress there. I think what people don't understand is, where is this $250 billion going? And is it going to be a leap in humanity at the scale of the Apollo program? Because it now is becoming the single largest capital allocation program in capitalism history. Nothing comes close. So I think that is a really interesting, maybe jumping off point to talk about what's going on inside of this business. I think they're doing all the right things below the line, but there's this one major big red flag above the line that has to be probably better explained by them if they want to have long-term shareholders. And basically what happened was, when people heard this, they said, this is a dumpster fire, we're out of here. And they basically said, look, we're going to slow headcount growth. Some teams will shrink. I think the problem is really in this Reality Labs. The amount of investment that they're making is so outsized and so abnormal and doesn't compare to anything anybody's ever seen. I think everything else in the business seems to be actually quite functional. So the problem is that this above the line thing, though, has become so big, it could sink the business. It's very, very hard to see an investment case for $250 billion of money in the door before you really start to see something magical. Now, they may have something super magical that nobody knows about, that they're going to unveil and say, ha, see, told you. And maybe there should be a set of outcomes where we plan for that. But the reality is, it's, $25 billion a year for the next umpteen years, and it's.
I thought the number was $10 billion. Where did the $25 billion come from?
No,
this number.
It's $4 billion a quarter right now, so $16 billion a year, and they said that they're going to significantly increase it to 2023. So I just assumed it was a 50% increase. Maybe significant means 100, but 16 goes to 25, and they said they're going to keep going at that pace. And so if you run that out till 2030, that's how you get to $250 billion. If you compare what Brad asked Facebook to do on Monday versus what Icon asked Apple to do in 2016, Icon basically said, just make this below the line change and everybody will be happy. It's a do no harm solution. None of us are getting in the way. We're not telling you how to run the business. The thing that I think that, what Facebook had to react to was Brad's suggestions were fundamentally above the line. It's like, firing 20% of the people or 30% or changing the capital allocation would require some changes to strategy. And I think this is a good moment to recognize that as much clarity as Brad's letter had and as much sense as it probably makes to outsiders looking in, the minute you have to tell companies how to change above the line, it's just a good reminder to me that no, it's not going to happen, because these folks will not want to make those changes. It's because the problem is, when you get compared to the Tesla program, look, Tesla is reinventing an entire category, trillions of dollars of energy generation and transportation, but they did it in 1 year of Meta Reality Labs spend. Apple reinvented an entire compute platform on 1/4 of Meta's Reality Labs spend. That's not a judgment, that's just a numerical observation. So if you want to get people on your side, you just have to be able to double click into that in an elegant, articulate way and say, here are all of these things that justify $25 billion a year.